Jotun is a hand-drawn action exploration game based in Norse mythology that was developed by an indie studio called Thunder Lotus Games based in Montreal. Having just gotten around to playing it 2 years down the line, I feel like some of the design decisions I'm about to bring up are nonetheless still very relevant today. Jotun in general is a very aesthetically compelling game. Everything from the smooth hand-drawn animations to awe-inducing backgrounds is designed to tie the game together into one cohesive visual style. The game does a stellar job of conveying a sense of scale. While everything seems comparable to you in size when exploring the levels, once your character stands side by side with a giant, you realize just how small and insignificant you are, which makes defeating the boss all the more satisfying. The soundtrack doesn't distract but rather complements your actions, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. And all of the above makes me wish the game shined just as brightly from all the other sides. But I feel like the title has a few unnecessary flaws that are worth addressing, if only to try and understand why they're there in the first place. Let's start small and focus on the character's movement. Even with a controller, a player is only allowed to move in 8 directions. I can see how it might not feel right for some people, but it works well in the context of the game once you get used to it, so I wouldn't say it objectively poses a problem. However, the developers decided to design the movement system in a way where your character is basically moving in a 2D plane, and the feeling of an extra dimension only comes from the background art itself. This creates a lot of problems when trying to distinguish between the background and the foreground, as well as often leads the player to misjudge the distance from point A to point B. A lot of the times you'll be behind the boss thinking you're close enough to get a hit in, while in reality you need to be a couple of steps closer. Being behind objects in general becomes quite an issue. When the player character is behind a boss, or let's say a wall, the only indication of where she is the shadowed silhouette showing right through the boss's model, which unfortunately is unnecessarily difficult to see at times. One particular fight that would drive my point would be Issa. The blizzard is raging all around and the boss keeps blowing cones of snow at you. All of this, in addition to Thora's size relative to the boss, makes it very difficult to understand where exactly you are. I feel like a simple red outline would have solved the problem, and I'm not sure if it was something the developers didn't think of or deliberately left out because it would infringe on the aesthetic of the game. All that aside, the character handles very well. You start the game having access to both light and heavy attacks. You're unable to move for their duration, but both animations are easily cancelled with a roll in any direction. So, although overcommitting to your attacks is somewhat costly, for the most part the game doesn't punish the reactive gameplay style, as opposed to something like Dark Souls where an extra swing can often cost the player another run back from the bonfire. This quite nicely brings me to the game's hitboxes. They are near damn perfect. To the point where it even feels alien at the start, because you as a player are so used to overestimating the hitboxes of incoming attacks. Meanwhile in this game they're exactly the advertised size. Considering the game often creates these close call situations, the hitboxes make it all the more satisfying to barely escape a shield smash or jump out from right under the boss. Taking a step back, let me explain what Jotun's gameplay loop actually is. The player's objective is to go into a zone, find the key, and bring it back to the start of the level. 2 such levels need to be completed in order to open up the gate which leads to the boss. One then fights the boss, and the loop repeats itself up until all 5 Jotun are defeated and you face Odin, before, spoilers, your eventual ascension into Valhalla. The majority of the non-boss levels feature something akin to a maze with occasional obstacles and hindrances such as timed blizzards or enemies throwing rocks at you. Aside from seeking the key to the boss gate, you're also free to look around for so-called god powers, such as Freya's speed or Loki's decoy, that provide you with additional active abilities. The player can also discover straight-up health upgrades in the form of Ithan's apples. Both definitely prove useful in the consequent boss fights. Unfortunately, this is the part of the game where the level design issues really start to show. There are no actual enemies to fight in the levels, and the few times that there are, they act as more of an additional hoop to jump through by throwing rocks at you or just piling up in hordes trying to overrun you rather than engaging the player in a meaningful fight. And that is completely fine if we keep in mind that this is partly supposed to be an exploration game rather than hack and slash, right? This point here is where I'm starting to get conflicting messages from the game. If the developer's main objective was to make the player feel lost in the levels, then they did definitely achieve that, for better or for worse. There's no minimap per se, and I realize that that is a deliberate decision, and I can respect that. However, the camera is locked way too close to the character, and the art assets in the levels are overused to the point where you sometimes cannot distinguish between two areas in a level, which makes navigating them a living nightmare. I cannot say that in my playthrough I ever specifically thought out the additional abilities or found one of the god shrines on purpose. I stumbled upon them very much by accident, and if I didn't manage to find any in the area, I never had a desire or in fact a need to go back for them. Once you've reached the main objective, you then have to run back to the beginning of the level to get to the exit. At times there are shortcuts placed throughout the area seemingly to make the task easier, but more than anything they just further confuse you, as it is very hard to remember where exactly you came from due to the problems I described just now. Don't get me wrong, the things you collect in the levels are very much worth your time, and more to the point, they're very fun to use because they diversify your gameplay. The problem is that the experience of traversing the levels gets so miserable you don't feel like being there for longer than is required of you to progress in the game. And because the additional abilities are very much that, and are by no means necessary to beat the game, it makes it all the less likely that the player is going to go exploring the levels. There is, however, one level I found to be an exception from the rule, as it was actually fun to do in comparison to all the rest. It was the Northern Sky level right before the Haggler's fight.
Dvalinn, næstminnsti hjörturinn, með horn sem borin af 7 stjörnum.
I believe it was the only level to incorporate actual puzzle mechanics, and as a result it became less of mindlessly wandering around the level trying to find the path to the objective, and more of having an actual side objective in the level that was fun to do in its own right. This made me want to explore more of the level in order to complete as many of these little puzzles as there were available. Let's contrast this with the boss fights. There are a grand total of 6 of them, and I don't actually have a problem with that. As long as the game is enjoyable and adequately priced, the length becomes a very subjective criterion, and I, for one, enjoy shorter titles. If I were to describe all of the fights in one word, it would be fair. The mechanics are solid, clear and easy to grasp and master, very skill-based, there is little to no RNG, and the hitboxes that I've brought up already act as a cherry on top of what I would already call a very satisfying challenge. I can by no means call the game hard, but it does pose enough of a challenge to make learning the mechanics and beating the bosses fun and extremely enjoyable. On top of that, there is something called the Valhalla mode, which lets you fight the bosses one right after the other at a higher difficulty and with all of the abilities already unlocked, if you're in the mood for seconds. And you'll say,
"But except this Valhalla mode you speak of gets rid of all the problems you have with the game, right? Why didn't you just play that?"
Well, curious listener, unfortunately it is only available if you've already beaten the game on normal mode at least once. And it is understandable. As a developer, I'd be concerned that a part of the player base might not get to experience the core portion of the game that I spent years working on. Now that hopefully you see the dissonance between the two main chunks of the game, here's a question that I've been asking myself ever since I finished it. Why did the developers feel the need to include the non-boss levels in the first place? Surely there are cases of games doing just fine without the filler content, like Shadow of the Colossus and Titan Souls for example. I have a few theories to share. Maybe the developers were trying to show off more of the art, which, as people tend to agree, is one of the stronger and more fleshed out parts of the game. Or maybe they wanted to fit in more of the lore and world building and tell people about Norse mythology, legends, and gods. That would make sense considering the actual plot of the game is very light. Maybe it was because they felt like without those non-boss levels, the game would have ended up too short, with only 6 bosses and no other content to speak of. They may have felt some sort of pressure and responsibility, specifically due to the game having been kickstarted. Lastly, maybe they just considered the game to have sufficiently good level design, Which is also very plausible because the Northern Sky area that I mentioned earlier clearly shows that they could have taken a different approach, and it seems like they just didn't want to. All in all, I believe Jotun does a lot of things right. The problem is that in its crusade to get away from the traditional top-down action formula, while also trying to fuse it with exploration elements, it loses out on proper pacing and player engagement in a very big way. I feel like people who are looking for a mechanical challenge will be bored by the non-boss areas, while people who are expecting a calmer exploration experience might find the game too frustrating or intense. Despite all of that, Thunder Lotus's debut title is very much worth playing. More than anything, in trying to find this middle ground, it creates something unique and, if I'm honest, quite charming. This has been Accept. Thank you very much for your time.